Thank you for having me here today. I know it's not easy to get up early on a Friday, so I appreciate you all doing that and coming here today. My name is Mickey Kudia, and I work for an organization called HEART. What we do is we teach kids compassion and respect for people, animals, and the environment. And one of the tools that we use for teaching kids compassion and respect is children's books. Today I'm going to share with you some of the tools that we use for teaching, for analyzing children's books, and looking for those messages that really promote those values. But to begin with, we're going to do an icebreaker. So what I would like you to do is you turn to a neighbor. I want you, if you don't know them, to introduce yourself and then share with them a book that is important to you. So for example, for me, a book that was really important to me was the book Sirens of Titan by Kurt Vonnegut. I read it in high school. Before then, I wasn't really a big reader. So it's like the first time that I really got excited about reading was through that book. And then also like Kurt Vonnegut's book, they all have kind of this message that like life is difficult and you kind of do the best of your situation. And that message was really important for me, especially at that point in my life. So I'd like everyone to turn to a neighbor and share a book that's important to them and why. Sound good? Okay, go. Does anyone want to raise their hand and share with the whole group a book that was important to them and why? Anyway, I know it's early. This is the most I've talked this early in the morning either. Does anyone feel like sharing with the whole group?
I'll go.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a pity, when you're like, oh, I'm just gonna sell it for Mickey, so I appreciate you doing that.
One of my favorite books is Creative Habit by Twyla Tharp. I had to read it in college, and I've read it pretty much every year since then. And it's a book about infusing creativity and imagination in every aspect of your life, and no matter what your profession is. And it's
I love that.
tool.
Yeah, so a lot of books, they have very practical skills that help us out. That's a great example of that. Anyone else want to raise their hand and share? Thank you.
I said The Kite Runner. I also, similarly to Mickey, read that book. I read that in high school. At the time, I also was kind of finding shortcuts around reading sometimes. As a high school student, who sometimes found a way to complete assignments without having to read everything they were supposed to. And so The Kite Runner, though, I was really into it the whole time. And it also was one of the first books I read that had a non-European setting and characters, and that was pretty important for me as far as thinking more about other perspectives.
I love that. And we're going to talk more about that. Is a lot of times that books, they can be windows into lives and situations that we wouldn't be familiar with. So it's a way of being able to see things that we wouldn't normally be able to experience ourselves. Do I have one more person that wants to share your favorite book and why?
Ooh.
A book that's
I
important
think
to
I
you.
missed that favorite. But
Okay,
I
important, I'm sorry.
The Jungle. I just read that recently.
Oh, by Tim Sinclair.
Yes.
Excellent. Why is that important to you?
I mean, historically, we're 80 years, 100 years later, and we're still combating some of the same issues. And I kept hearing people say, read the Jungle, and here I am, I'm like, oh, I've never read that. And it was good.
I like that. Yeah, and the interesting thing about The Jungle is that it is, it's not a documentary, it's not nonfiction, but it is realistic fiction. It tells the story of a man that works has a job, and how he's being exploited by the workforce. So it's interesting because it's not, in a preachy way, but it does help you understand a perspective that might be different from your own. Okay, is there anyone else that's really dying to share? Okay, then we're going to move on. So it's always nice to begin presentations with a quote. So I'm going to start with this quote. It's by Ariel Dorfman. He wrote, "Industrial produced fiction has become one of the primary shapers of our emotions and our intellect in the 20th century. Although these stories are supposed to merely entertain us, they constantly give us a secret education. We are not only taught certain styles of violence, the latest fashion, and sex roles by TV, movies, magazines, and comic strips, we are also taught how to succeed, how to love, how to buy, how to conquer, how to forget the past and suppress the future. We are taught more than anything how else not to rebel." And Duffman was very critical of the messages that we see in the media. And in today's presentation, we're going to talk about some messages that might be problematic. But we're also going to talk about how books can be used to show us how to be better people as well. And this is really important, is that when I talk about books that have problematic messages, I'm not saying that you should destroy or burn every book that has any message that might be a little bit maybe has a bad message to it. But the idea is that we're aware of these different messages, so that when we see these messages that might be problematic, we can identify them and discuss them with students. And then when we see positive messages, we also know how we can discuss those with children, how we can make those more explicit when these messages can be more subtle. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea of explicit versus implicit. So an explicit message is a message that's very clear. You can't misunderstand it. An implicit message is a message that you can't like read between the lines. It's not obvious. So for example, an explicit message is it's okay to be different. The explicit message here is, anyone want to guess? It's okay to be different. Yeah. And then here, this is a different book called This Is How We Do It. You know, like the song, This Is How We Do It. Anyone familiar with that song? Okay. I like to sing that when I read this to kids. But anyways, so this book is about the author. He traveled to different countries, and he lived with families. And he wrote a book about what the families ate, what they went, where they went to school, where they lived. So he showed people all around the world, individuals, how their lives were. And this has an implicit message that, even though we're all different, we all have similar needs. We all need food, we all need a place to live, we all have families, we all need an education. So this was an implicit message. It kind of has the same message, but a little bit different in an implicit form. Uh-oh. Okay, there we go. Next, this is a picture from Berenstain Bears. Who wants to raise their hand and tell me what do you think is the explicit message in this? It's not a trick question.
The golden rule.
Yes, the golden rule. So do unto others what you have them do to you. So it's very clear, you couldn't miss it. But there's also implicit messages in this as well. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to turn to a neighbor, and I want you to discuss what might be some implicit messages in this image or in the Berenstain Bears in general. So implicit messages about a family, or about the roles of parents and children, or implicit messages about gender, or any of these things. Just turn to your neighbors and share any implicit messages that you might identify, just from this image or your understanding of the Berenstain Bears. Make sense? Okay, turn to your neighbor, discuss. Does anyone want to raise their hand and share any implicit messages in this image or in the Berenstain Bears in general? I know it's early, but I would appreciate just being brave. Raise your hand, even if you're not sure it's the right thing to say. Thank you so much.
We were talking about maybe the little girl did something wrong, and so that's why the parents needed to step in and teach her about the golden rule, and maybe it was with her brother. I think there's 2 kids in that family. So.
Okay. So what might be the implicit message there?
Is that you want your, it could be either that she was treated poorly by her brother or vice versa.
So that brothers and sisters fight.
Yeah,
Might be an
that
implicit message
rivalry
that
and
happens.
that, yes.
I like that. Anything else?
So if you're a big Berenstain Bears fan, I still am, so there's a lot of interesting gender dynamics in the family. Sister's always wearing pink. Mom stays home. She takes care of the kids. She cooks. She cleans the house. Dad has an outside job. Dad takes care of stuff outside of the house. So thinking about gender roles and how they all fit pretty neatly into what is expected of them.
Yeah, that's a great point. And even, like the idea of a nuclear family. You have the mom, you have a dad, you have 2.5 children living in your house. So it definitely has a message about like what family should look like and how families interact. Anything else?
We were talking about just how the message is on the wall, in the living room with the chimney. So it seems like for this, it's very important for the family to just have it displayed.
Yeah, so like how it's important, like how parents should act, how it's then important for them to explicitly teach morals to their children is an implicit message. Even though it's not just that specific message, just in general, how that's important for parents to do. Okay, can I get one more person? Be brave. Thank you.
So I know a little bit. I'm probably not as passionate as you about the series.
Well, let me stop you there. It's okay. Like, it's supposed to be a conversation. I don't like talking that much, so
At the
please.
same time, it seems the books that I have read that mom tends to be the moral compass of the family.
Yes, that is a good point. If you're familiar with Berenstain Bears, mom is always the one that has to take care of the kids often, and then like the dad's kind of like a buffoon. I don't know, like whenever he does things, he's all kind of like wacky and can't really do things right. So it does have kind of messages about like how fathers should act and how the mothers should act as well. And with these stories, there's nothing wrong with being a nuclear family. I'm like a mom and a dad and 2 kids, and there's nothing wrong with girls liking pink. There's nothing wrong with girls liking bows. But an implicit message that you get is when you hear these messages over and over and over and over and over again, that kind of influences how you believe that you should behave. So it influences how you think a family should look, influences how you should be if you're a certain group that's portrayed in here. And then another thing too is that if you are never included in media, that also has an implied message about your importance in society. So it's not just what you see, but it's also who does not get included in these things. That has an implicit message in itself as well. So moving on, we're going to talk more about specific messages that are in, first about people in children's books. So we're going to talk about ones to avoid, and then we're going to talk about messages to promote. Then we're going to move on to animals. We're going to talk about messages about animals to avoid, and then message about animals to promote. So to begin with, we're going to talk about stereotypes, dishonest information, white savior complex. These are messages to avoid when it comes to children's books. So this is the book, The Medicine Wheel. This author is not Native American. He wrote a book that was inspired by Hopi dancing. And can anyone raise their hand and tell me what is, just by looking at this book, what is a problem with this? What might be a message? Yeah.
Or what is dressed stereotypically?
Exactly. Yeah. So for this, I'm sure this author had the best intentions. They're like, I'm going to make this book where I'm going to show, people all around the world getting together, but they use stereotypes to do this. So I use stereotypical images of people all across the world. In addition to that, he's not Native American, so he's trying to portray Native American culture in a way that was not accurate. So the problem with this is that it's hurtful to people to have these stereotypes, and then secondly, it's not giving kids accurate information about different cultures. Next, this was a book that had a lot of controversy when it came out. It's called A Birthday Cake for Mr. Washington. This book was about Hercules, who was a chef and slave for George Washington. And it was about him making a cake. The author did research, and he did talk about how there is a lot of evidence that he took pride in his work. But how is this dishonest? What might be a dishonest message that this gives to children when you use images like this?
Oh, I mean, he's a slave, and it kind of portrays that like a positive experience of slavery as opposed to touching on the horrific elements of it.
Exactly, and this is a type of bias called rose-colored goggles. So there's certain things in our history and even present day that are very upsetting, and we think we are protecting children by making it look bad. So they call it rose-colored goggles. And the problem is that when you do that, you're kind of lying, you're being dishonest to children. And when you do this is that those kids are going to grow up and they're going to be adults who believe this dishonest information about their past or about present problems that are going on in our society. So, even though it might make us uncomfortable to talk about these topics, we need to do it in an honest way. This is another one. This is called The Mangrove Tree. This book by itself is not, a bad book. It's about a man named Dr. Gordon Santo. He went to country, Etria, and what he did was he taught people there how to grow mangrove trees, because what was happening was the salt water was getting into the area. It was causing it so they couldn't grow anything. So he taught them how to do this. And on its own, it's a fine book, but a problem is that it promotes an archetype of the white savior. And this is a story, like a narrative that happens over and over and over again, where a white person goes into a community of color and changes things. Or a person from the Western world goes into a non-Western country and solves their problems. And the problem is that when you hear this story over and over and over and over again, what it promotes is the idea that people in non-Western countries, people in communities of color, cannot solve problems. It also gives a inflated self-sense for white people and the Western world. So, on its own, there's nothing wrong with the story, but when you hear the same message over and over and over again, that's when it starts to change and be problematic. So, conversely, here are some messages that you want to promote. So the first one is the idea of diverse windows and mirrors, then honest information, and finally, actors, not victims. So windows and mirrors, it's an analogy that was created by a woman named Dr. Look at my notes. Rudith Bishop Sims. And I'm going to show you a video of her explaining this analogy.
We need diverse books because we need books in which children can find themselves, see reflections of themselves. I wrote a piece, maybe in 1990 it was published, which I called Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors. And I think that's really why children need to see themselves reflected, but books can also be windows, and so you can look through and see other worlds and see how they match up or don't match up to your own. But the sliding glass door allows you to enter that world as well. And so that's the reason that the diversity needs to go both ways. And it's not just children who have been underrepresented and marginalized who need these books. It's also the children who always find their mirrors in the books and therefore get an exaggerated sense of their own self-worth and a false sense of what the world is like, because it's becoming more and more colorful and diverse as time goes on. So I think that's why.
Okay, so windows are the ability to look into something that is life that is different than your own. And then mirrors is that you need to see yourself reflected in the media that you look at. So for example, Steps is probably an excellent example of a mirror for a lot of young people growing up in the city. This book is just about this group of kids that like to hang out on the steps outside where they live. They play games there, they socialize there. So this is a good example of like a mirror. And this is a book called Chinatown. This book is about a young man walking through his neighborhood. He lives in Chinatown, walking through his neighborhood with his grandma. This is a great mirror for children who live in Chinatown, and it can also be a great window for children who have never been to Chinatown, so they can see what a different neighborhood is like. This is a book called The Upside Down Boy. It's a memoir, so the author wrote about his own experience coming to America. He talks about his fears of having to come to school and not having to speak English for the first time. He says that he's afraid that his tongue is going to turn into a rock. So this is a great way of having a mirror for children who are coming to the country. In addition to that, it can also be a great window for children that don't know this experience. They can kind of understand what that would be like. Another one is One of a Kind Like Me. This is a true story about a young boy who wanted to be a princess in his school's parade. His mom helped him pick out an outfit for the parade, and this is a great window or mirror for children that might have an expansive gender expression. Moving on to Honest Information. This is a book called Africa is My Home, A Child of the Amistad. So Monica Ingrid, when she wrote this book, she did extensive research. She actually found some primary documents that were never found before about a young woman who was on the Amistad. She did extensive research on it, and it shows you that when you are going to make children's books, you still need to make sure that your facts are accurate. You still need to do the research, that you present in honest information. Next is Shishi Ipko. This is a book about a young woman who in 4 days has to leave her home because she needs to live in a residential school. So residential schools were schools where they forced Native Americans to live on to become westernized and to be indoctrinated into away from their own culture. So this is an important book because a lot of times this history is not taught in schools. These schools lasted until 1996 in Canada. And to the earliest 20th century in America. This is a book called Something Beautiful. So this is a book about a young woman. She's looking for something beautiful in her neighborhood. So she goes around the neighborhood, she talks to people about all the beautiful things in her neighborhood. One of the people that she talks about like watching people dance in the park. She goes to the grocery store she goes to, and the person there explains how the fruits and vegetables are beautiful to them. In addition to that, she also sees some things that are not beautiful. She sees a man outside sleeping who's homeless. She also sees someone wrote the word die in graffiti outside of her apartment. And this book has been lauded as having an honest portrayal of city life for a lot of children, and also having a positive ending. So in it, she talks about how what she wants to do is she erases the graffiti. She talks about how in the future what she wants to do to change things and to appreciate all the beauty that she sees in her neighborhood. Next, we're going to go on to actors, not victims. So this message means that we want young people to feel empowered and to know that they can take action when they see injustice or things that they think are not right. So it could be things in their own life or when they see it happen to other people. An example of this is a book called Emmanuel's Dream. This is a book about Emmanuel Yusuf. So Emmanuel was born without a leg in the country of Ghana, and he biked throughout the whole country. And while he was doing it, he was talking and giving speeches about disability rights. And what happened at the end of it was he helped bring the first disability rights laws in the country of Ghana. Next we have Cisse Puede. This is a realistic fiction. It's not a true story, but it's about a young man that his mother is going on a strike. She's a janitor, and she's going on a strike, and he wants to be able to help her and support her, but he doesn't know how. And in school, he learns about Cesar Chavez and the farm workers, United Farm Workers Union, and the work that they did to improve conditions for farm workers, and that inspires him to create a poster for his mom during the protests. This is Child of the Civil Rights Movement. So this is another true story about a young woman whose family was involved with the Civil Rights Movement. A nice one about this is a lot of times children's books are about like the leaders or the celebrities from the Civil Rights, not celebrities, the leaders of the Civil Rights Movement like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. This is a good one about, there's many just like ordinary people that took part in it, including young people such as themselves. And now we're going to move on to messages about animal civility. So the first one is irresponsible treatment, then dishonest information, and last is anthropomorphizing, sometimes. That's funny. So this is a picture from a kid's book. Can anyone raise their hand and tell me what might be irresponsible about the behavior in this image?
None of those animals should be around humans.
Yes. So a common thing you see in children's book is people interacting with wild animals in a way that is dangerous. Animals are extremely stressed out when they're around people. Like for example, sometimes people are injuring rescued birds and just being picked up by a person can give them a heart attack. So being around humans is not healthy for the animals. It's also dangerous for people, but it's a common thing that we see in children's books. Often we also see a lot of books where they have like dogs and cats just kind of like roaming around the neighborhood unsupervised. And we see kids interacting with injured animals as well, which can be dangerous for them too. The dishonest information. So this says down here, baby bear holds his toes. He wants to be a circus bear when he grows up. He wants to make all the children laugh. What might be dishonest about this?
Baby bear doesn't want to be in a circus.
Anyone want to share the whole group? Glad we're all waking up with it. Okay, I'll say it's probably obvious. Is that what I
Well,
want to
it's
say?
kind of like that book about the chef who's also a slave. Like it's saying this bear is super pumped over being held in captivity.
Yeah. Like captivity is it's complicated. A lot of people said there's a lot of good reasons to have animals in captivity. Other people say that even though it's not best for the animals to be in captivity, that individual there's other reasons to support it. But the reality is that no wild animal wants to be in captivity, even though there are certain reasons why they have to be. And with the circuses, I don't know if you're familiar, but Ringling Brothers and a lot of the circuses are now no longer existing because the way that they train the animals are often abusive. And then anthropomorphizing, what that is when you give human qualities or characteristics to an animal. And this can be like good and bad. We're going to talk a little bit more about it. There's a lot of controversy within humane education about whether you should use it and when you should. But if we look here, you see this chimpanzee. It's about a book where this chimpanzee is, he likes to eat spaghetti, or she likes to eat spaghetti, and then she's trying to convince her friend to like jump on a bed. And the problem with that is that a lot of times kids, they don't know that this isn't a real chimpanzee. So when you give animals like human characteristics, it's confusing for kids, and they don't know how to interact with animals in an appropriate way because of that, because they kind of see like animals as like little people when that's not the case. And then here's another example. This book is about these dogs. They're supposed to be like children, but like in the book, they're dogs. It says, but their mother was greatly displeased. So you're the little puppies who dig holes under fences, she said. No chocolate custard for you tonight. And she made them go straight to bed. what problems might this teach children?
Dogs can eat chalk.
So if your dog is bad, yeah, feed them chocolate, which will kill them. And another thing too is that a lot of times kids are confused about how to train or interact with animals. So they think that they like, I'll withhold your dinner tonight, and that will show you not to do it. But that's not an appropriate way to train animals. So it's confusing too because they don't know how to train them. They think that they can give them food that's not appropriate for them. However, sometimes people argue that anthropomorphizing, it's like not an issue in certain situations where it's clear that the animal is not an animal. Okay, so if the kids can understand that this is definitely, not a real animal, it's just like a pretend, fantasy book. So for example, this is a book, Arthur. Most kids do not even see Arthur as an aardvark. They just kind of think he's a kid. And this even has a good message. So in this book, Arthur, he gets a puppy that's not anthropomorphized. So he gets a puppy, and DW wants to punish the dog for going to the bathroom inside. But Arthur explains that you have to be patient with your dog when you're training them because they're just learning. Next one is Berenstain Bears. Most children realize that Berenstain Bears are not, like really bears. They understand that they're like people, and it's like a fantasy. So messages about animals to promote. The first one is the human-animal bond, then honest information, and finally the animal's perspective. So the human-animal bond is the idea that people and animals, we have a mutually beneficial relationship. So animals enrich our lives, and then in exchange, we are supposed to be stewards or protectors for them. This is a very cute book. It's called Max Talks to Me. It's about a child and his friendship with a dog. So he talks about how he has to take care of the dog, clean its water, give it food. And then he also talks about how the dog listens to him and knows when he's feeling upset. So it's about that bond that he has with his companion animal. And then another thing too is teaching explicit skills about how to interact with animals. So does anyone here know someone that they don't like dogs or cats because when they were younger they were bit or scratched by a dog or cat? Anyone here? Okay, a lot of people. So one of the things that causes people not to form that kind of bond with animals is those experiences. So explicitly teaching kids how to interact with animals in a safe way is important. This book is about a dog explaining to this young man how to pet them in a safe way. So you ask the owner, you let the dog smell you, then you look to see if they're scared or nervous. If they're not, then you can go in and pet them. Usually you want to teach kids to pet them under the head so the animal can see your hands. So keeping those explicit skills. Another thing too is teaching kids how to train animals in a using positive reinforcement and how to do it in a humane kind way. So having trained animals also helps you build that bond with them as well. And then it doesn't always have to be companion animals. The human-animal bond applies to wild animals as well. The book Fly is about a young man that can't go outside because his neighborhood's too dangerous. So he likes to watch the birds through his window. And he learns a little bit more about them from an elderly neighbor who lives above and takes care of the birds and has names for all of them. So through that, he learns even more about his relationship with the animals through his neighbor who talks to him about it. He has names for all the birds. Another way, too, is talking about books where people come together to help out animals. The Subway Sparrow is a book about a sparrow that accidentally ends up on a subway train. And what happens is the whole car comes together to help rescue the bird and get them out of the car safely. And then for honest information, this is a book called It's Raining Pups and Dogs. It's about a young woman who wants her dog to have puppies, but her dad takes her to the animal shelter, and she learns about how there's a lot of dogs and cats that don't have homes. So while she's there, she learns about this, and she decides that it's probably best that the animals who don't have homes get adopted first before her dog has puppies herself. And this is important because there's 8 to 10 million homeless dogs and cats in our country. And a lot of times people are uncomfortable talking about this, especially because kids love animals and puppies are so cute. But explaining to kids why it's best not to have puppies at this time is important. Another example of honest information is a lot of books, when they portray farms, is they show farms in a way that's not realistic. So often it's one dog, one pig, a horse, in this big red barn. And when children get older, they kind of believe that's what farms look like. But modern animal agriculture does not look like that. And this is important because nowadays there's a lot of changes in people's views about how we treat animals on farms. And in order for kids to have accurate information and to understand this, we need to give them honest information when they're younger as well. And this book, it is, pretty biased for animals, or for, animal protection, because it's created by the Humane Society of the United States. But it does portray factory farming in a realistic way. So this one is more biased, also from the perspective of the animal, but it is important that children know the realities of certain situations, or at least they're not lied to about them, so that when they're older, they can make more informed decisions about animal protection issues. Next, we're going to focus on animals' perspective. So animals' perspective is important because first it teaches empathy and perspective taking. And another thing too is that when children put themselves in the place of the animal, it also helps them have a bond with them. So when you can understand their emotions and their perspective, that also kind of brings you closer and connect with animals. So for example, this is a book called Ivan, The Remarkable True Story of the Shopping Mall Gorilla. There's another book called The One and Only Ivan, which is a chapter book. It's a similar story. And this book is about a gorilla who was taken from his home. He was put in a shopping mall as a display, so he's in this room all by himself. And the book does a great job of demonstrating how lonely and boring that would be to be in a cage all by yourself. And this is a great way of helping kids put themselves in that same situation. How would you like being in a place all by yourself without anyone to talk to or interact with? And they can connect kind of with those emotions. Similarly, this is a book called Bunny Unchained. It's about a dog that was chained outside, and it has a happy ending where he's eventually rescued. And then the last one is Hey Little Ant. So Hey Little Ant, it's a boy, he's talking to an ant. He tells the ant that he wants to step on him, and then they have a conversation back and forth where the ant, it's nice because it's sing-songy, it's a rhyme. And the ant explains to him how he's just taking food to feed his family, and how he doesn't want to be stepped on because he cares about his life as well. So some educators, though, in the humane education field, they don't like this book because it breaks one of those rules I said not to do before. Does anyone remember what?
Animals.
Yeah, so it's anthropomorphizing. So there are some educators that say don't use this book because it anthropomorphizes. Ants don't really, he has a table with his family, all eating the crumbs. Some people say that teaches unrealistic ideas about animals, but then other people, like myself, I use this book because I still think it's good that it teaches them perspective. So this is kind of a debatable issue for a lot of people when it comes to anthropomorphizing. Okay, so now, well first, are there any questions about any of those things that I discussed? Okay.
What about when it comes to picking nonfiction for students particularly about animals? Do you have any thoughts about that?
So, I guess if it's, the idea is realistic nonfiction, is, it's important that you don't anthropomorphize for that and for, honest information. If it's, a fantasy, then, young people understand that this is not real at all. You know what I mean? Sure. So it kind of is helping them understand the genres as well, so that they can kind of make that, understanding of, is this a real animal or is it not? Anything else?
Think movies like Pixar or anything do a bad job of this, or do you think that's fantasy enough for kids to bridge that gap, or do you think there's anything bad about that?
I think with all these things, it depends on the kid as well. So it's a lot of these things, it's our responsibility as adults to have these discussions so that they can make these differentiations. Like I said before, none of these books are bad, all bad or all good. There's certain books that I would not use because I think they're kind of hurtful, the ones that have horrible stereotypes in them I would not use. But with anthropomorphizing, I think a lot of it kind of depends on us explaining those differences to children and having questions that they understand them. Does that make sense? So with the ant, you can ask oh, so is this how real ants act? And they'll be like, no, they don't have a family that sit together. Or they'll be like, yes, they do. It's no, this is just kind of a silly story to help us think about how the ants feel. Anything else? Okay.
I took a communications class, I took a couple of communications class in colleges, and a lot of them were about your exposure to media. And one of the key things that they pointed out, to answer kind of your question, is children typically don't recognize the difference between, reality and fantasy until 4 to 6, somewhere in there. So it's the conversation.
Yeah, and developmental level.
Yeah.
Developmental level as well. So I feel they're a high schooler, they get it, but younger, it's a little bit more challenging. It's interesting because with Ivan, So this one, it does not anthropomorphize, but if you read the older chapter book, it's written from the perspective of the gorilla. So they do, take that into account. So for the younger children, they don't anthropomorphize for this book. It's a picture book. But then for the chapter book, they do, because they can kind of understand that the children will make more of a distinction between those things.
It's actually interesting that you say that. My mom is a school librarian, and she was talking about the one and only Ivan, and about how a lot of the kids, the younger kids, because
Yeah.
it was like a whole school summer book, and the younger kids were really struggling with the idea that because it is based on it's based on a true story, like the gorilla exists. They had a lot of trouble like figuring out that Ivan can't actually talk. He's not a talking gorilla. And so because they knew it was based somewhat off a true story, that distinction became really unclear for them.
Yeah.
So it's interesting you say that, because the older kids, I'm sure, had no problem with
Understanding.
that,
This is
yeah.
like realistic fiction. It's not
Mhm.
just, the gorilla's not really thinking these things in their heads or talking in human language. Okay, so now I'm going to have you all, in a little bit, you're going to get up and next to the food, like one shelf over, there's a bunch of books. And what I'd like you to do, you can either work individually or in small groups, however you want to do this. How about we do in like pairs or small groups? Does that sound okay? Okay, everyone have a friend today? Okay. So get with a pair. I want you to find one book that you think has really like positive messages that you'd want to talk to a student about to make sure that they're explicit. And then one book that you might find something that's like kind of problematic. It doesn't mean that like I would never use this book, does that make sense? But like maybe like you find one thing in here you're like, this might be something I'd discuss with the student when I write with them. How about this? Turn to someone that you did not pair with, that was not in your group, and then I'd like you to share the book that you found with a positive message, the book that you found with a problematic message. So, thank you. I saw a lot of really good conversations going on, so I appreciate that. Does anyone want to raise their hand and share anything about the books that they found? So you can choose if it's just one book that you want to share that you thought had really, positive messages that you want to share with the whole group so everyone uses it, or if you found any problematic messages that you wanted to point out to the group. Would anyone like to raise their hand and share? Thank you.
Well, I picked a book that I'm sure everyone's familiar with called Wonder, and it's the hot book. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, up to 20-year-old set. And a movie was just made of it. And the book is about it's written from the point of view of a 10-year-old boy who was born highly disfigured and experienced something like 20 or 23 operations from when he was born till now. And his mother decides that it's time for him to go to school. She's been homeschooling him. The father at first disagrees, and then flip points of view, but at any rate, he goes to school. And the story is about differences and acceptance and disabilities and abilities, and it has a lot of Pollyannishness, if that's a word, about it. But the message comes through crystal clear to the kids who read it or who it's read to. And the interesting thing, my 8-year-old grandson fell in love with the book. I gave it to him, and the reason I knew about it was I was in a bookstore up in Canada, and whenever I'm in a children's bookstore, I ask the kids, what should I bring back? And this 12-year-old girl said, "Oh, your grandson has to read Wonder." And she went on to explain the whole thing. But if you do get a chance to experience it, all I can say is either make them read or read to them the book first, and then the movie. Because my grandson was very upset that there were parts that weren't in the movie.
That movie just came out, it's out right now, right?
Yeah.
My daughter's going today.
Oh, she
It's
is?
a girl class.
How old?
12.
Oh my
They
God.
read the book first.
Then they're all just in love with it, yes.
And I love that too, because that's such a powerful, when we talk about windows and mirrors, like for students that might feel like they're not representative, and then also being able to look into the life of a student that has that disability. And another thing too that I didn't talk about that's important for all these books is that if it's not engaging, kids aren't going to get these messages. So they don't want to read it. If it's not like a fun, they can't put themselves in the lives of the characters in the book, then it's not going to get the message as well. So the great thing about Wonder 2 is such an engaging book that kids love, and it really like helps drive home that message. Yeah.
Sorry, just one more
Oh,
quick
yeah.
comment. My grandson, who's 8, saw it as a book about bullying, not a book about disability.
Yeah, and it's a book, like actors, not victims.
That's
That's
okay.
excellent. Thank you. Who else wants to share?
Oh, sure. So I picked out a book called My Dog Is Lost. And it's about this little boy who moves to a big city. He's from Puerto Rico, and he can barely speak English. And he's living in this home all alone with his parents, but on top of all that, he's lost his dog. So he doesn't know how to find the dog. He's not familiar with the community. He's not familiar with anybody that he's living with except for his parents. And so at the end, the community comes together to help him find his dog. And so what that means to me is that you can move somewhere and eventually you have to build up your community. You may not know people, but you will find friends. You will find a community that will help and support you. And so I thought that was a really strong message.
Yeah, I love that book. That's one of my favorites. I love how too, with some of the messages we talked about today, bring it back to that, the idea of first windows and mirrors. So, a big part is he has a challenge because he doesn't speak the language. So he's trying to find his dog. He has to kind of like act it out and have people help him in order to find his dog. And then, also like the human-animal bond is, so clear that he, is so sad and tired and trying to find his dog and how important that relationship is to him.
Yep.
Anyone else want to share?
It's not specifically about my book, but while you were talking, I was thinking, I always read Dr. Seuss,
Yes.
right? Simpler, I'm simple mind, right? Green Eggs and Ham, what's the take on Dr. Seuss, right? I mean, it's very fictional or very, made up characters.
You tell me. Because like this, I think, I'm sorry, that was a glib person, I apologize. But like, the whole idea of this is not for me to tell you solid yes and solid no. Does that make sense? It's like, I don't want to tell you
See, I
yes
come
or
from
no.
the school of mind of read your kids,
Yeah.
right? And then at a very young age, they were picking up on words, right? They couldn't really read it, but they could see that that's a dog.
Yeah.
That's a car, that kind of thing. And you read your kids, and next thing you know, they're reading, and you just kind of go.
Yeah.
I never thought about it that hard,
How about a cat and a hat though? Think about it, right? So the cat comes in, mom is out, and it's 2 kids with a very, very tall cat,
Mhm.
And all the wacky things that they do while mom says, yeah, go and play, but it's very early fantasy, if you would, in my mind. But it's, it's sending a very mixed message, right?
Letting strangers in your home?
Yeah, letting strangers in your home, or that a cat can take care of you, or that you should be home left alone, all those kinds of things, but yet it's very fantasy oriented.
Let's bring it back. So like next, we're almost out of time. I'm sorry. But how would you discuss that with your child? So it has messages that you don't like. What would you say? Oh, I mean, with a kid, like how would you discuss that?
Yeah, so you talk
I'm sorry.
about, I'm pretty raw. I asked, so, do you think a cat can take care of you?
Meow.
Do you think a cat can really sing? So I really ask questions like that. Do you think you should not, when my kids were younger, should you be at home with just a cat?
Yeah.
How about if you're home with just our dog,
Yeah.
So you have those, is this real? No. Well, what tells you it's not real? So I have a son who has a disability, and so a lot of the things that we talk about very early and often
Mhm.
because you have to have that right perspective, right? And sometimes it's hard, and now he's gotten older, it's, Mom, it's not real. Come on, it's not real. So now you know that, the 4 to 6 range, right, where we say that kids kind of separate the difference. My son is on the upper end of that range, so it's been more in the 7 to 8 range.
Mhm.
But now we know that he's got it, right? But, it's all things.
Yeah, and I think that's, exactly the thing with all this is having the discussion, so you can ask questions to do it. You can also use other books You know, so like with Curious George, you know, also a book about what chimpanzees are really like. You know, so you know, a nonfiction book about that. So, you know, bring another book together that shows that. One more thing is that you can also just talk about your own experience. So you can have the conversation, you still read the book, just explain to them how that message might not be the most accurate. And I am out of time. So thank you all for coming here today.